Welcome to the 2018 World Dairy Expo. I'm Keith Sather, and on behalf of Feed Supervisor and Hoof Supervisor, we're proud and excited to sponsor today's seminar. KPI, your yardstick to improve what matters on your operation. Our speakers today are Dr. Tom Fuhrmann and Terry Battcher, consultants for DairyWorks. Key performance indicators, KPIs, are numbers that become tools for measuring effectiveness when making management improvements. This seminar will dive deeper into understanding what numbers can be classified as KPIs and how to implement them into a management strategy. Leading the discussion is the duo of Dr. Tom Fuhrmann and Terry Battcher of DairyWorks Management Systems. Dr. Fuhrmann founded DairyWorks as an outgrowth of his veterinary consulting practice and now coaches, trains, consults, and troubleshoots production management issues for dairy producers and their employees. Battcher, a specialist in employee training, strategic planning, labor efficiency, milk quality, production, and implementation of new technology, brings additional hands-on experience to the team after being a managing partner during his family's dairy expansion. This seminar has been approved for continuing education credits from the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists and the American Association of Veterinary State Boards. Our ACE program forms are available in the back of the room when we're done today. And when I say excited, I just have my own personal experience of 20 years ago working with Dr. Fuhrmann on some mutual clients, and as I told him before we started today, I still have my 3-ring binder from my original DairyWorks on my shelf that I still consult with. So with that, I just want to introduce these guys and let them get going.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Terry Battcher, General Manager of DairyWorks, and my colleague, Dr. Tom Fuhrmann, the founder of DairyWorks, which was founded about 20 years ago. So thank you very much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you. I'm extremely excited to get to work alongside Dr. Fuhrmann, and this one opportunity. He hasn't been back to the Dairy Expo now in a few years, so I really enjoy the excitement of having him here. So our goal today is to talk about KPIs. The objective of our conversation is, number one, to introduce you to a system that will easily allow you to identify opportunities on your operation by using a numeric system, a system that allows you to put numbers in place to identify when the goals that you've established on your dairy are being accomplished. And number three objective is to allow you an opportunity to communicate with your employees. The dairy industry is an ever-evolving industry, and as we know now more than ever, the interaction between the owner and manager and the employee is at a more important level than ever. I'm from California, where labor is at an all-time shortage. Labor is more difficult than ever to have. So through this conversation, we hope to give you an insight on how you can use KPIs to communicate to your team.
But before we talk too much about KPIs, there are two basic principles that we should revisit just to make sure that we understand where the KPI concept fits into your responsibility as a manager of a dairy. So I'm going to review with you the 3 responsibilities that managers of dairies, you, whether you're an owner manager, or a professional manager, what are the 3 things you do every day? The very first thing you're charged with is to figure out how to do work on your dairy. I use the word systems and equate that to work. Somebody on your dairy has to decide, this is how we do it here. The manager's first responsibility is figuring out, this is how our milking routine is going to be. This is how we're going to load the ingredients on our feed truck. This is how we're going to feed colostrum. The second thing that a manager does after he or she sweats blood to figure out this is exactly how we're going to do it here is to train your employees. Your employees are not going to know exactly what you want unless you actively go out and explain to them, this is what I'd like you to do. Finally, the third objective of any dairy manager is to get results. So you're going to have to walk around with your antennas up all the time, trying to figure out, is this the way we're supposed to do it? Could we do it better? Is this going to produce the results we want? If we look at what a manager does, you're all about organizing work and workers to produce results. The second principle we have to review briefly is the relationship between management and leadership. I call this the management leadership matrix. Successful managers do both. They understand the principles with regard to management, and those are the same whether you're managing a dairy farm, a beef operation, a retail store, or a taxi company. You have to understand management principles, but we have to contour or customize those for dairy managers. The second thing every successful manager has is leadership ability. We have to talk about those two things separately, even though together they are the two components that make successful managers successful. So if I can just go into this a bit more, there is a big difference between organizing work, training, monitoring people, and providing feedback. There's a big difference between that and leadership. Leadership can be defined by one word. It's influence. There are leaders in the world and there are followers. There are managers and there are workers. Leadership is the manager / leader saying, I want to influence you to feed colostrum the way I want it done. I want to influence you to wipe teats the way I want to have it done. So you see, you have to have some influential component in your makeup of being a successful manager. Now, leadership isn't always easy. Leadership only occurs when there's an interpersonal interaction between at least two people, the leader or manager and the follower or worker, or between that leader and several people. If you're going to influence people, you have to have an interaction that grows trust between those two people. Trust is the cement. Trust is the glue that allows the leader to meld with the followers. And because developing trust with people is not easy, and it's easy to be a cowman, it's easy for a lot of you to have cowmanship, it's far more difficult for some of you to have leadership. Most all of you in this room have it, but I'm here to suggest to you when you leave this afternoon, you'll have a greater appreciation for the need that you have to not only grow your leadership ability, but to grow the leadership ability of key people underneath you who have to be influencing some of your people, like the daytime milkers versus the nighttime milkers, and you can't be there at nighttime to do it. So to have that kind of trust, you have to have a certain set of skills that makes you a leader. You have to recognize those skills and grow them every day. Because the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, is that people and your workers decide if they're going to do what you ask them to do. They're going to decide if they're going to do what you tell them to do. And the only way that's going to happen is for you to know management principles and to develop your leadership skills. So if we look back on this and we say that management is organizing work, training people, and providing feedback, if we look at it, the first part is analytical. It's fairly easy. But if you're going to train people, if you're going to build trust, if you're going to monitor them, 2/3 of management is the leadership capability you have to have and you have to develop. So with that in mind, what the KPI concept does is focuses on these second and third parts of what a manager really, really does. Okay? So, we can start out with this phrase, and you've all heard it. It's so common, I don't know who the author was. You can't manage it if you can't measure it, huh? The problem with a lot of us is we have put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. If we put too much emphasis on measuring, you're going to have paralysis by analysis. So much data that you're not going to use it. So what Terry and I are going to talk about is a simple record system that allows you to put more emphasis on managing people, utilizing the right kind of data. So if we look at this, there's an author of a book, his name is Wheeler, who comes with the conclusion that data is generally collected as a basis for action. That is really the summary of what key performance indicators can do for any business, but can certainly do for your dairy business. So let's start out by just talking about what are key performance indicators. There are 4 components to this definition. The first thing is key indicators are small numbers of strategic measurements, as few numbers as possible. Preg rate. That tells you about breeding. You could look at 10 other things that tell you about breeding, and then you get confused whether or not you got a breeding problem or not. But if preg rate's all right, a lot of things are going right. A small number of strategic measurements collected from each area of the dairy. Preg rate tells you how your breeders are doing. Somatic cell count and mastitis gives you a pretty good idea how your milkers are doing. Dry matter intake gives you a pretty good idea how your feeders are doing. So they are collected from each area of the dairy, and they're representative of general performance. A preg rate of 35% sounds good. You could still find out next year you don't have enough heifer calves born because maybe you've got an abortion problem. So they're not a perfect measurement, but they are going to tell you that if it's in line, there's a lot of good things happening on my dairy. And finally, these are numbers that can be measured and monitored frequently. And I think most all of us would agree that if we can do this monthly on most large dairies, it's a pretty timely way of doing it.
So what does this look like? What does a KPI measurement sheet look like? It's as simple as a one-page form. Try to keep it simple. Try to identify the opportunities on the dairy, but keep it in a very simple form. This is in a very simple form. This is what a KPI sheet would look like on a dairy.
So what we have to do to make that sheet a practical piece of information for you is understand that you've got to define the teams of people on your dairies. You do not manage reproduction. You as dairy managers manage the people who give the ovsing shots, who thaw the semen, and who inseminate cows. I dare say you don't even really manage milk quality. You manage the people in your parlor who are supposed to clean teats, four-strip cows, attach machines. Because as Nelson Philpott said one time long ago in his career, mastitis is a disease of people that shows up in cows. If you can get your people doing things right, assuming that as a manager you've defined this is the right way to do it on my dairy, then you're going to get results. So you have to have teams of people. Then you have to have, as every team has to have, a leader for that team. That's why we talked about leadership. Every team has to have players or workers. Every team has to have a coach. One of the failures that many of us have in the management structure of our dairy is failure of a head of every team. The third thing you got to have is a way to measure the people performance. So if we look at this, you really need to start out with what I call an organizational diagram of your dairy. And I know this sounds academic. I know this sounds like pink, philosophical, fluffy stuff. But you all think you have things organized on your dairy. Until you put what you think is going on paper, you don't really know. And I've been on your dairies, and I know this. If I go and talk to you about how you think who's the head milker and who's going to make the decisions about treating baby calves or not, and then I go out and I work with your people, what you think and what they think are very often two different things. So what I'm suggesting to you is when you start thinking about this, every employee on your dairy should have a name, and that name should be somewhere on a diagram that allows you to define teams. If you can define teams, the second thing that can happen is you can now define the leaders of each team. if you can define the leaders of each team, you can now say, you are my associate, my supervisor, the person who's going to be responsible for influencing my people when I can't be there. When that happens, we can now develop some key indicators that are going to help you up here and these key people to know whether or not the rest of the workforce is doing things right. So in essence, you get a KPI report card for each team of workers on your dairy. And that, in simplicity, is what records allow us to do. So now let's look at how information is currently being controlled or run through your dairy. And I think you all know this, but I'm going to present it in a way that perhaps you haven't thought about before. If you look at information on your dairy, it goes through 4 steps. It's collected, then collected information is analyzed. Analyzing is a no-brainer step because all that analyzing does is arranges collected information so that you can do the 3rd step, that's interpret. That means a person, you the manager, has to use your gray matter to decide, is this good or not? If it's good, I can motivate my people. If it's not good, I got to change something so it does allow you to act upon the information that you're collecting on your dairy. Because this is what happens on a dairy. A cow and a close of pen calves. Somehow or another, you're going to put a person next to that animal because now you've got to move her in your computer, in your Dairy Comp or PC Dart or DHI Plus. You've got to move her from a dry pen to a milking pen. The second thing you have to do is you have to get the ID on the new calf because now you've got to enter a heifer in the inventory of your herd, right? When you guys do that, you end up with, generally, action lists. So now with that database, you can figure out this is the group of animals we got a preg check today. Or this is the group of animals we're going to dry off today. Terry and I believe that utilizing the KPI concept, you can do more. You can now take that same kind of information and have an impact on improving the management and the leadership of your people. So now let's go back to this 4-step process, and let's talk about it in just a bit more detail. We're going to start talking about collected information.
So the collection of information. The first thing everybody thinks is, I don't have time to collect more information. I've got so many things to do as a dairy, as a manager. How do you accomplish that time? The good news is, ladies and gentlemen, the information you're asking to collect on a KPI is information you already have on your dairy. It's the information like your preg checks. It's information like your breeding results. It's information on your calf reports. It's information you get on the end of milking reports. It's information you already have.
So collecting information is not a big bugaboo when it comes to KPI stuff. There's very little more that you're going to want to have to collect as you start putting together this 1-page spreadsheet. So then we go to the second step, and the second step is analyzing. I prefer we call it arranging data, because all you're doing in this step is regrouping information.
So as Dr. Fuhrmann said, now we're taking that information and put it into an arranged group. So in this example, we're organizing it into production groups. We've got our milkers, our feeders, breeders, health team. We also organize it by weeks, so we can analyze it on a weekly and monthly basis. So we're categorizing and arranging it into 2 columns, basically, by groups of team members that are doing the procedures on the dairy, and by time, which is a week.
Then the third step is nothing more than interpreting. This is where the gray matter decision-making process comes in.
And the nice thing about interpretation, it can be very overwhelming at times. Interpretation gets out of control, but we put it in the simplest form. What we're asking is you, as the manager, to make the goal. You decide what you want to accomplish on the dairy. If your somatic cell count goal is 200,000, you can see now you're just putting it into a category where you can say, have you accomplished it? Yes or no? It becomes very black and white.
There's a lot of managers that say, I just want to get the best somatic cell count again. I can. I just want to get the highest pregnancy rate I can. Ladies and gentlemen, that will not work if you're going to manage and lead people. You have to, in front of God and your employees, put your head out there on the chopping block and say, we are going to manage our dairy so that we get us an ag cell count of 200,000. We are going to manage our dairy, that is, manage the work and train the people so that we're going to get a pregnancy rate of 35%. So these goals have to be yours. And when they are yours, writing them down not only makes a great impression on your workforce, it's going to have a hell of an impression on yourself, putting yourself on the line and saying, this is what we're going to do here. Then the final step is taking action.
So now we've collected the data, we've arranged it so we can identify it, we've interpreted it, and again, as Dr. Fuhrmann said, we want to take action. So on our example up here, we can see on our milkers, in yellow, we have not accomplished the goal that we've set. But compared to our feeders, our breeders, and our calf team, all of our short-term KPIs are being met. So you as a dairy manager now take action. This would be the time you would say, I probably don't need to spend a lot of time in those areas on my dairy, but there are opportunities that I'm missing. I'm not accomplishing what I want in my milkers. So you need to go spend time with your milkers and identify, are they doing the protocols that you've put into place? Are they doing each of the steps that you've asked of them? Or perhaps you've got the protocols that need to be tweaked. Maybe you thought the protocols were put in place and are being carried out, and they are. The protocol needs to be changed. But again, another opportunity is identified in this KPI. You can see that we've got some maternity issues that are happening, which are leading to early culls, 60 days of milk. A lot of animals are leaving this dairy less than they want in their KPIs. But if you look back on their KPIs, it also shows that they've got a lot of interaction with assisted livings and dead on arrivals. So it gives you that opportunity to take action on your dairy.
So basically, you guys are really busy. And it takes a lot of management energy to identify problems and then hone in on them. This allows you to prioritize and decide, part of my dairy is going good, the rest of it we're going to move on. So now let's go back, and I want to use an example of colostrum management, going through the 3 steps of what a manager does and showing you how the KPI system can help you focus and motivate your people. Again, if you're a manager, we're going to talk about colostrum delivery. You're the one that has to decide this is how we're going to do it here. The way to do that is use standard operating procedures or protocols. In this particular case, we're going to have 4 steps in how we collect and feed colostrum. Step number 1 is we're going to collect and process the colostrum, and it's got 4 or 5 sub-steps indicating we're not going to milk every cow after calving. Rather, we're going to group our cows that calve together into 2 groups, those that calve during the nighttime, and we're going to milk them together. In any event, you're the one that's going to determine the details of step 1, step 2, processing the colostrum to get it ready to feed, step 3, the actual feeding of it, and step 4, how we're going to accumulate the information and how we're going to clean the equipment. Your first responsibility in this example, defining this is how we're going to do it here on our dairy. After you define that, the second step for you is to train your workers. Training is a whole lot different than teaching. Teaching is stimulating minds to figure out problems and think things through. Training is much more mundane. Training is simply saying, this is how we do it here. I want you to do it here this way. And you guys as dairymen are excellent trainers because you know what you want done on your dairy. You're so familiar with it, you do it all the time. If you have people that are into it and they watch how you do it, you become an excellent trainer. But the fact is, if we're going to talk about feeding colostrum, somebody's got to train these guys how we're going to milk the fresh cows so that we eliminate bacterial contamination of colostrum, get milk let down, and harvest the maximum amount of colostrum. Then we got to figure out how we're going to move, in this case, commingled colostrum from a pail or a can into, in our case, 1 gallon or 4-liter jugs. Then you got to train both the day and the nighttime people to segregate the freshest colostrum from the older colostrum so we can feed the freshest colostrum first. Then we have to identify that we're going to take the storage nipple off this bottle and use an esophageal feeder, and we're going to feed every calf 1 gallon. This is not a seminar to tell you how to feed colostrum. This is a seminar to say, as a manager, you define the steps on how you're going to do it on your dairy, and then you train people to do it because we've got a recipe. This is how we do it here. The third thing you do is you monitor. And here's where you're going to use key performance indicators. Suppose in this dairy, the key performance indicator is we want to see more than 95% of all the calves that are born having a total protein score of 5 or greater. That protein score is going to be high only because they've gotten adequate colostrum. If you do this, you're going to have to set up a system where you're going to bleed every calf. If 3 calves are born on Sunday, 3 calves are going to be bled on Tuesday. If 7 calves are born on Friday, 7 calves are going to be tested on Sunday. It's a simple, easy cow-side test. You just let the blood sit so that you get the serum harvested. You put the serum on a refractometer and measure it, and you write it down. It is a way for calf people to help you monitor if the maternity people are doing their job properly. So now with this information, you got to do one of 2 things. And there are 2 words in the vocabulary of every manager that you have to come to terms with. The first thing you've got to do when results are good, you got to motivate your people. Because if I motivate somebody, the chances that they're doing things right and are passionate already is pretty high. I want to keep that fire in their belly. It's also that if I tell you you're doing a good job today, the probability that that worker is going to do a good job tomorrow is quite high. So we in the dairy industry need to do, in my opinion, a better job of communicating to people when they are good people, understanding the protocols, and implementing them correctly time after time. When that happens, you can do it on larger dairies with having that key person that's the head of the maternity staff in your meeting once a month, using your KPIs as the primary agenda for the discussion in that 1-hour meeting. At the same time, if you're going to be a leader, either you have to do some of this communicating to your people one-on-one, or at least now your herdsman can go and talk to those people one-on-one, and it's not just, I like this guy, so I'm going to be nice to him, or it's not just a subjective decision. You now have enough ammunition in terms of having numbers to help you secure your confidence in saying to people, you're doing a really good job. The end result is you want those people to do the same thing tomorrow that they did yesterday, because now you're using extrinsic motivation, your communication about good results, and you're firing the belly with more information to give that fire that's in their belly gasoline so that it can grow and bloom and have those people do the same thing tomorrow and next week and next month. The second word that you have to understand in the vocabulary of a manager is discipline. Discipline is something that has to happen when you have employees that are not following protocols. The simple definition of discipline is retraining. You cannot retrain unless you've trained the first time. You can't retrain unless you have standards and protocols in the first place. If something is going wrong with one of your employees, a real key, a tip, assume the problem is you, the manager, not the worker. I didn't train people right the first time. So when you're going to discipline somebody because they're not feeding the colostrum within an hour, or they're just going to say, I'm not going to warm it up and just going to feed it out of the refrigerator, or they're going to say, I'm just going to let the calf suckle instead of feeding it with a tube. When that happens, you and or the immediate supervisor is the person that needs to retrain those people. Now, through the School of Hard Knocks, I can give you a tip, a 3-step tip on how you can professionally retrain your employees without degrading them and still accomplishing what you want. Step number 1. When you see something going wrong on your dairy because a worker is not following a protocol, and you know that because the KPIs are out of compliance, step number 1 is step back. Take a deep breath. Don't let your emotions control you. and investigate. What's happening here? How come at nighttime we're not doing this? How come we're not warming up the colostrum properly? Step number one is to get control, investigate, and make sure that the protocol or standard operating procedure is being violated. Because you are going to find if results are poor and people are doing the right thing, then the other problem is the protocol that you are the author of isn't correct. Almost always, when Terry and I get to dairies and work with people, the vast majority of the problem is people not following protocols or you guys as managers just not having them in the first place. If we step back and investigate the problem, the second step then is to separate the bad action from the good person. If you get right out there and say, hey, you're not doing this right, your people are going to get defensive. If you say, on the other hand, I've been watching you, and you're not wiping teats according to the system that we talked about, are you? Are you doing that? Are you really grabbing, twisting and pulling, watching and doing everything? No, you're not, because I just saw you. You see, if you engage somebody and you say, make the emphasis of the discussion, the protocol and the action, I can now get into a dialogue with almost anybody and convince him or get him to admit, even though he's going to be fibbing a little bit in the beginning, we're not doing this right. Then you can really engage the person to get them committed to doing it right in the future. Because what you have to do is just what I tried to demonstrate briefly. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, you might be cow people, but on the size of most of your dairies today, you have to be people managers as much or more important than cow managers. And unless you develop this leadership that I'm talking about, the interpersonal interaction, unless you do it with both subjectivity, I don't like what I see out here, and data, and the data confirms it's not right, you're not going to have that same passion and that same enthusiasm for talking with your people. So now what we'd like to do is talk about a real-life example that occurred on a dairy that utilized this KPI concept to help the improvement of their dairy.
So all this information we're giving you, how do you as a manager put it back to dollars and cents? Because we're managing a business. It takes input and output. So I want to walk you through an example. This example happened on a dairy outside of Arizona. But first of all, I want to walk you through a study by Dr. Thomas Cant in Michigan. He looked at fresh cows leaving barns. He looked at the cows that are leaving the barn, and on the bottom axis, you can see days in milk. On the horizontal axis, the vertical axis, you can see percent of cows that left the dairy in days in milk. Research was showing that a large number of these animals are leaving the dairies early. In fact, the summary of that shows that 35% of all cows that left that dairy on those 100 cows, dairies, and the 100 dairies that were studied, show that 35% of those cows left by 2 months in milk. When they looked at first calf heifers, they found that even a higher percentage of those first calf heifers. Ladies and gentlemen, that's 4 out of every 10 heifer that calves doesn't make it to the 3rd month in milk. That's a lot of dollars. So if we look at a study done by Dr. Steve Stewart, the information comes back the same. Their study showed that 24% of all cows that calved never made it past 60 days in milk. And that was based on 14,000 cows that were studied. So now we're going to take that and put it into a practical sense that means something to you guys right here today. So we looked at an Arizona dairy we worked with. This just wasn't an average dairy. This was a 3,200 cow dairy milking 3 times a day. But again, not just an average dairy. This was the highest producing dairy in the state of Arizona. So I think we can all make one assumption. They probably did a lot of things right. So on this dairy, they were doing above and beyond what the average guy was to have the highest production in that area. But they as well were using the KPI tools that we teach right here to use the software management to identify that they as well had a 60-day in milk problem on their herd. They were losing too many cows that were being culled early. So what they did is they listened to the consultants, they listened to the management tools that we provided through DairyWorks, and this is what they accomplished.
So this is a picture of the cull rate on their dairy the first year we got involved. Again, by 60 days in milk, about 24% of animals were leaving the herd. So this owner said, we got to do something about this. So you see, the first thing that happens when you've got some information, and you guys are smart, you're aggressive, you're passionate. If I tell you you got a problem, you're going to figure it out. You're going to do something about it. So what we did here is the first thing that this manager and those of us in DairyWorks said is, we really have to clarify who's responsible for this. It turns out we have a maternity and fresh cow herdsman, and we wrote a job description. I'm suggesting to you that for your benefit and for the benefit of a few key people on your operation, write a job description that is comprised of 3 different components. Component number 1, the group of animals that Tony and his team is responsible for. In this particular case, Tony was responsible for all animals when they entered the close-up pen, including heifers, through calving and through the first 20 to 25 days in the fresh pen. Now it's clear where Tony and his people, what they're responsible for. The second part of the job description are the specific duties that Tony and his people have to do. Tony, a daytime person and a nighttime person, and a relief guy are supposed to observe close-ups, assisted calvings as necessary. The second thing they're supposed to do is process fresh animals according to a fresh cow processing protocol that you designed with Tony's input. We're going to group all the animals that calve together at nighttime. We're going to process them in this way, and we're going to milk colostrum this way. The third thing Tony and his people are supposed to do is feed 1 gallon of colostrum according to the colostrum delivery protocol. You saw an example of it a few minutes ago. The fourth thing Tony and his people are supposed to do is move animals to the fresh pen appropriately, move them out of the fresh pen when time is right. They're supposed to lock up, evaluate, and treat fresh cows according to the fresh cow management protocol. So now Tony and his people are going to be charged with looking at every fresh animal every day, identifying candidates that might be sick, and doing enough investigation to prove yes or no they're sick and apply the appropriate treatments. They're then supposed to complete calving and fresh cow forms daily, and Tony, before he leaves work every afternoon, is to take the information on those 2 sheets that his people have manually put into pre-printed forms and enter that information in the dairy comp. So it becomes the supervisor of a team, his or her responsibility to enter the simple data that you want to have collected every day anyhow. Finally, Tony is going to manage his 2 maternity technical people and a relief person. So now we have the second part of a job description for a key employee written out. The third component that I see missing in most job descriptions are the standards by which you want Tony and his people to work. On this particular dairy, because they had a problem, this manager and the DairyWorks people identified 4 key indicators that we were going to use to help Tony and his people focus on the opportunities we had to improve fresh cow management. And they included, first of all, dead on arrival rate. This manager set a goal, I want 7% or less. How do we compute that? We simply take the number of calves born dead and divide that by the number of births in a day or a week or in a month. Simple calculation. You can get this anytime you want off a Dairy Comp, PC DART, or DHI Plus, right? The second thing we looked at is total protein levels in newborns. Again, the goal was to have more than 95% of all calves have a total protein score of 5 or greater. What did we have to do? We had to collect the blood samples, like I showed you a minute ago. What did we have to do? In this particular case, we had to build a small little spreadsheet so that the people in the calf area could write that information in. So at the end of the month, the manager had to look at that and say, you know what, we got 99% of our calves that have evidence of good passive transfer of antibodies. So what we're doing is distilling down information, trying to establish for Tony and his people what those standards are on our dairy. The third one was percent of culls less than 60 days of milk, and obviously this includes both animals that leave the dairy with their feet up and with the feet down, because we want to know how many animals we're losing. And finally, we're going to look at incidence of DAs. All we really did is focus people. If we go back to the 4 steps of information, we have identified how we're going to collect it because we have 2 forms pre-printed. People are trained to put that information in, and all I got to do is enter that into Dairy Comp. The analysis part of it is now we've just organized it and put it in a spreadsheet like Terry's showing you over here. We do that with all 4 of those key indicators. We've already got it. It's just a matter of taking it, a secretarial job that's going to take 10, 15 minutes at the end of the month, and put it in this simple sheet over here. With regard to interpretation, we've made it pretty simple. We have the goals, and we got the average of what's happening. The decision-making process is simplified. And then finally, we're looking at the action. And again, in this manager, because he had a problem, he had meetings with the people weekly. Today, that manager is having meetings once a month. Today, that dairy that had a 20-25% cull rate on animals that are 60 days of milk and less, they not only hit below 7%, they're now in the area of having between 3 and 5% death loss on a routine monthly basis. This stuff works. We then helped him not only redo the job description, retrain the people, both the maternity people and the fresh cow people on protocols, help them tighten up their protocols so that what they really wanted to have happen was practical and was correct. So here's what happened. This is the result of that dairy a year later. Let me show you in detail. This is before the training. This is after the training. I'm not a scientist. I'm not as dumb as I look. I know that I can't compare one year to another. They're slightly different animals. But on this dairy, it was the same people. It was the same management culture and philosophy. It was this data I'm showing you was during the summer. It was a hotter summer the second year than the first year. It was the same veterinarian. It was the same nutritionist. In fact, it was the same people with the exception of one maternity person who, when we worked with them, we finally identified a person who just couldn't get it done. As hard as we tried, he didn't have enough fire in his belly or enough capability to recognize the signs of labor, when to intervene or not, or quite how to do it despite training. So what happened here? From year 1 to year 2 in that summer, we went from a cull rate of about 5%, less than 60 days of milk on the entire herd, and we cut that down in half. On this dairy, if 25% of the animals that were culled were leaving by 60 days in milk, after the training, it was half. Figures don't lie, but liars figure. 152 animals were lost the first year. 69 animals were lost the second year. I can develop a story and say we saved 83 animals. If I put a dollar figure on that, just in replacement cost only, not in genetic loss, not in other medication loss, time consumption or whatever, this dairyman made $100,000 with nothing but management energy. There was no nutritional change. There wasn't any foo-foo dust. There wasn't any super vaccination. It was just refocusing his people.
So ladies and gentlemen, when you look at this, here's a dairy that's doing a very good job on a lot of things. We're able to find $100,000 plus for that dairy by doing 3 simple things, which are the goals to our presentation tonight. One is to look at KPIs. KPIs are nothing more than a simple way to look at numbers. To take that simple form, turn it into numbers, where the most important thing is that you can communicate to your employees in a way to motivate and discipline them. Thank you very much.
I would just want to add one caveat here. If you look around in the audience, we've got all ages of managers, huh? The millennials, the young people, you want data. You expect data. You have to have it. This is a concept that is not very sophisticated, and don't undersell its importance. Because even though you're used to all this techie information right now, that information isn't accurate unless you got some people cow-side capturing it. You define the definitions of, for example, what a calf born dead is, but you guys are the people that are going to take this information and eat it up and use it and do better than we are. Some of you in this audience are old farts like I am, and we don't like data. We just want to manage and be cow people. I'm telling you, at the size you are and the risk of your investment and the way the tight margins are in the dairy industry today, you can take basic, simple information and convert it to an ability to help you judge how your people are doing. And for us old farts, it is a really good thing to help put things into place. The best group in this audience is the ones that are in between. Some of you have got the understanding and the need for the information, and you're also old enough to know that the practical side of this will work. So as Terry said, we hope that this 45 minutes you spent with us is worthwhile. We were asked to do this in 45 minutes because we would entertain any questions or listen to comments, because some of you are smarter about some of this stuff than I do, than Terry and I are. And I know that because I know some of you in the audience. So if there's any questions or comments, we're happy to take them right now. Yes, sir.
Tom, it's easy in large herds to have reliable numbers. And as herds get smaller, there's more variance around these numbers. And without getting overly complicated, how do we keep dairymen from running down rabbit holes that aren't real?
You know, and that's a really great question, and size does matter, huh? If I were to look at conception rate, and I've only got 50 animals, well, let me just stop and say this. Every number that you're going to judge has got three components to it: a numerator, a denominator, and a time period. So if I'm on a small dairy and I'm only got 20 breedings in a month, a conception rate of 50% doesn't mean much, nor does a conception rate of 10%. So if you have 200 breedings, now that means a whole lot more. So I think the first thing you're pointing out is that you got to use some common sense here and identify what's a reasonable number to have confidence in. That's why in the example that Terry had, we're looking at some numbers that we only record once a month, other numbers that we record every week. So you're going to have to use your common sense, your dairy understanding, and the awareness that small denominators, small numbers on the bottom side of that fraction, don't give you as much confidence as larger numbers do. I don't know. Other than that, I don't know what to say. What do you think?
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, I do some of the same KPIs, and so I found myself writing a report to a dairyman that says first service conception rate of mature cows is 62%. First service conception on older animals is 44%, and I wrote this long diatribe as to why it was all a problem. And then I threw it through a small statistical model, which is not relevant, and it came back completely random.
Exactly.
And I had to delete that and say, move on.
Larry's got enough scientific background that you know all about the statistical significance in that. Some of us as managers got to have an awareness of that. I don't think you need to take a statistics course to figure that out, but that point is really well made.
I've got a question on meetings. So on my dairy, say I want to start out and have a monthly meeting. I see lots of people start out with them, and then within a couple of months it falls on the wayside. What are a couple of key things to keep those meetings on track and make them relevant and make everybody who attends feel like, wow, I did something good here?
Well, part of it is having those KPIs that you're putting those down on paper. A lot of times when you have a meeting and you don't have an end result in mind, you'll lose the track of it. So by having those KPIs recorded, that every time you get together and you identify those KPIs, you now have a conversation to challenge your guys on. And let's say you have a meeting and after 3 or 4 months, every one of your KPIs has been identified and met. Maybe it's time to rethink your goals and move your KPIs to another level of goals.
Another tip or two. First of all, if you're going to have a meeting, have the agenda, and as Terry is saying, the KPIs are a great agenda. Set that meeting so it's going to last no longer than 1 hour. decide on a basis who should be in that meeting. And now I'm going to go out here and walk on thin ice. For most of you, that meeting should be the manager and either from 1 to 4 or 5 key people that are key people in your operation that you rely upon to help influence the rest of the people you can't touch your hands with yourself. So if you're only milking 200 cows, you don't really need to have this meeting. If you're milking 2,000 cows, I can assure you, you need to have this meeting. And just set it in concrete. Once a month, the last Wednesday of the month from noon to 1 o'clock, we're going to have a meeting. Now is the time to have this KPI form filled out. So you have copies for everybody around the table, and the agenda is, well, let's look at what's happening with our overall production. We had 1 week that wasn't so good, but everything's cool. What happened with our somatic cell count, or our milkers? Holy cow, we're not meeting our somatic cell count. Hey guys, look at this though. Our incidence of mastitis is normal. What do you think we should do about this? You see, now you get those 2 other key people engaged, especially if you got somebody that's responsible for the parlor. What would you say, come on now, what would you say if you got a somatic cell count problem where it's higher than your goal, but your clinical mastitis is low? Yeah, the milkers aren't identifying some cows with abnormal milk. Do you see how a little discussion around the table, now all 5 of your key people know what the problem is? So now even the maintenance guy might be tuned up so that maybe you get out there and say, hey, we got to make sure the pulsators are working and everything else, huh? So you see how this kind of thing, as simple as it is, allows the opportunity to involve more people on your dairy. Even if you have the problem figured out, they are now part of the solution. They become involved, and now you got this key group of key people that are all aware and moving forward. And what's going to change this? You're not going to get a vaccine to solve this. You're probably not going to change tit dips to solve this. You're not going to do anything but get more focus on force stripping cows and pulling out some of the cows that probably the milkers up to this point in time were letting go. That's really as simple as it is. Don't overdo the meetings. The average dairy needs a meeting once a month. And the last thing I'm going to say that I learned through the School of Hard Knocks, you don't need high-priced consultants at that meeting every month. Trying to get a nutritionist and a veterinarian and a genetics company and your banker and all that every month, it's not worth it. It's not cost effective. It is not necessary. Do this with your key people. And when an issue comes up like somatic cell count and you can't solve it yourself or you want to work on it some more, make sure that super vet is there with you. But that's how you do this. What do you think? God. Yes, ma'am. That's a question for this gentleman.
Yeah, well, it's live streamed and the videos will be available later. Anyone else?
I just have a comment. Tom worked on my dairy probably over 15 years ago, and he changed my life, okay? This stuff works, okay? I would recommend him to anybody.
And I'm also available for marriage counseling. No.
All right, anybody else? Otherwise, I want to thank Tom and Terry for their presentation today. Hope you all really have a great time at the Dairy Expo, and thank you again for attending this meeting.